Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Reed Sullivan, and welcome to the inaugural episode of The Story That Stuck, a podcast where we explore the mistranslations, misconceptions, and misunderstandings throughout history that shape the way we see the world today. Now, before we get started, a lot of my friends have asked me, Reed, why do you want to start a podcast? And honestly, the answer is simple. I'm a white guy approaching 30. At a certain point, nature just starts pushing you towards one of three things: podcasts, smoking meats, or explaining World War II documentaries to people who did not ask. This felt like the cheapest option, honestly. And please bear with me while I figure this whole thing out. I'm sure there'll be a few kinks, hiccups, awkward pauses, and at least one moment where I completely forget where I was talking about halfway through a sentence, but that's part of the charm, or that's at least what I'm hoping and telling myself. But seriously, if you have any suggestions on how to make this podcast flow better, or if there's a historical misconception or story you'd like me to cover in a future episode, drop a comment or send me an email. I'll put the address in the show notes. I would genuinely love to hear from you. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's get started. So picture it, Sicily, 1912. I'm totally joking, of course, but I will never pass up an opportunity for a Golden Girls reference. Okay, so picture it for real this time. It's the late 1400s. You and your crew have been stuck on a boat for nearly 2 months. Food is running low, morale is somehow even lower, and everybody smells like wet rope and bad decisions. You were hired by the Spanish crown to find a new trade route to places like India and China. But at this point, you're probably one more storm away from a mutiny. Then suddenly, land. You lose your mind. You think you actually did it. You think you found a new trade route to India and Asia. Except you didn't. You're actually about 8,900 miles away, about 14,000 kilometers from India, standing in what we now call the Bahamas, which is honestly the geographical equivalent of saying you're looking for Target and then accidentally ending up in a Chili's parking lot. I don't know. By now, you probably figured out that we're talking about Christopher Columbus. And if you grew up in the American public school system, you probably remember hearing some version of, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And somewhere along the way, we were all taught that Columbus discovered America. Well, that's not exactly true. First of all, there were already millions of indigenous people living here, which is usually a pretty big clue that a place already has been discovered. Secondly, Columbus wasn't even necessarily the first non-native person to arrive in the Americas. Depending on which historians you ask, he may have been the third. And maybe the funniest part of all of this, Columbus himself never even realized that he had stumbled onto an entirely different continent. He died believing that he had found a new trade route to Asia. Imagine making one of the biggest accidental discoveries in human history and still technically being wrong about where you were. So how did a guy who got lost become remembered as the man who discovered America? Well, that story starts a long time before Columbus ever stepped foot on that ship. So around 500 to 800 AD, the Lusitans, a branch of the Taino people, settling in now what we call the Bahamas. So by the time Columbus showed up, people had already been living in the Americas for centuries. Actually, millennia. In his journal, Columbus described the natives as kind, peaceful, and generous. He wrote, "They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things. They willingly traded everything they owned. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." Which is honestly one of the fastest transitions in history from, wow, these people are so nice, to, we should commit absolute war crimes. The quote shows two things. First, how welcoming the native people were, and second, exactly what Columbus's intentions quickly became. So before this turns into a full-on Columbus roast, let me clarify something. When I say in this episode, discover America, what I really mean is that they were the first non-native people we know to arrive there. Because you can't really discover land that already has people living on it. That's not discovering, that's showing up late. So, with that all out of the way, we need to address one more thing before we can continue, and that's geography. Depending on where you went to school, what counts as a continent can get weirdly controversial for something involving giant chunks of land. In the US, along with countries like Canada, the UK, Australia, and most other English speaking countries, we were taught that North America and South America are two separate continents. Nice, simple, clean. Meanwhile, in many Romance language countries like Spain, Portugal, France, and most of Latin America, they teach that America is actually one giant continent. So to them, saying the Americas is kind of like saying the Earths. Earths? It's a harder word to say than I was expecting. Earths. If you get my drift, hopefully you do. So since I'm a goofy American, I grew up with the two continent model. That's the version I'll be using here, with Panama being the dividing line. And yes, there's actually a sneaky reason for this choice, because before Columbus, there were actually two major groups who reached the Americas first. One connected to South America and one connected to North America. So for today, splitting the land masses apart makes the story a whole lot easier to tell and less likely to start a geographic war in the comments. According to the Viking sagas, Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland around the year 982 after being convicted of manslaughter, which in classic Viking somehow turned into an exploration mission. Instead of keeping a low profile, Eric sailed west and discovered Greenland, giving it a much nicer name than Giant Frozen Rock Island to convince people to move there. Shockingly, the marketing actually worked, and Viking settlements soon appeared across Greenland. And technically, Greenland also sits in the North American tectonic plate, meaning the Vikings may have already discovered or reached North America before they even made it to Canada. Later, Ericsson's son, Leif Erikson, sailed even farther west and reached what is now modern-day Canada nearly 500 years before Columbus. Now, it's important to mention that the Viking sagas are not straight-up history textbooks. They're a mix of historical fact, oral storytelling, family genealogies, and mythologies. Basically, history, but with a Hollywood budget. The stories were written centuries after the events were described, so parts of them are clearly dramatized. They are deeply rooted in real people, real places, and real events. For a long time, historians debated on how much of the stories were true, until archaeology stepped in and ruined that argument, actually. In 1960, the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Anstein Ingstad discovered the remains of an 11th century Norse settlement at Alans Olmedos. Hopefully that is how you pronounce it. I do not speak French, so please forgive me. On the northern tip of Newfoundland. It was the first confirmed Viking settlement ever found in North America, proving the sagas weren't just Viking fan fiction. And the science behind dating the site is honestly kind of remarkable. So in the year 993, Earth was hit by a massive solar storm that caused a worldwide spike in carbon-14, leaving a radioactive timestamp trapped inside tree rings and across the planet. Scientists found the exact marker from the year 993 inside pieces of wood used by the Vikings at Lancel Meadows. By counting the rings from the solar storm marker to the bark edge, researchers determined the trees were cut down in the exact year 1021. Even cooler, microscopic analysis of the wood showed clean cuts made by iron tools, something the local indigenous groups in the area did not use at the time, but the Norse actually did. Researchers also found butternut seeds and evidence of wild grapes, plants that do not grow naturally in Newfoundland. This suggests the Vikings traveled even farther south into mainland Canada or the Gulf of St. Lawrence before returning north. So while the sagas definitely added drama and a larger-than-life storytelling, modern archaeology and science have shown that they were very real Viking expeditions in North America centuries before Columbus ever set sail. So now that we have North America wrapped neatly up, let's head south. Historically, Christopher Columbus is credited as the first European to step foot on the South American mainland during his third voyage in 1498 when he landed near the Orinoco River in what is now Venezuela. But once again, history refuses to be simple. Modern genetic research suggests that Polynesians may have actually reached South America nearly 300 years before Columbus ever showed up. In a 2020 study published in Nature, scientists analyzed the DNA of modern Polynesian and indigenous South American populations and discovered evidence of contact between the two groups around 1200 AD. Specifically, the genetic markers point towards indigenous peoples from what is now coastal Colombia or Ecuador mixing with Polynesian populations in the eastern Pacific. So, in other words, somehow, across one-third of the entire planet, people in wooden canoes found each other in the middle of the Pacific Ocean centuries before Europeans managed to stop arguing about whether the Earth was shaped like a pancake. What makes this especially impressive is the Polynesians were already some of the greatest navigators in human history, using only the stars, ocean swells, wind patterns, birds, vibes, basically just whatever, that, like a modern GPS could not comprehend. They managed to settle islands spread across millions of square miles of open ocean. Scientists have long known they reached remote places like Easter Island around 1200, so reaching the coast of South America may not be as impossible as it sounds. There's also physical evidence backing this up. Sweet potatoes, a native crop to South America, were already spreading across Polynesia before European contact. Researchers also found shared genetic ancestry between Polynesians and indigenous South Americans that predates Columbus by centuries. While scientists still debate exactly who traveled whether Polynesians sailed to South America, South Americans, the evidence strongly suggests that these cultures met long before Europeans ever entered the picture. So while Columbus may have been the first recorded European to reach mainland South America, it seems the Polynesians beat him by almost 300 years, which honestly feels very on brand for people who looked at the Pacific Ocean and thought, yeah, I can probably cross that. So after all of this, one thing becomes pretty clear. The story of the Americas is a lot bigger, older, and way more complicated than the version most of us learned in school. Long before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, millions of indigenous people were already living across these continents, building civilizations, trade networks, and cultures that had existed for thousands of years. The Vikings reached America centuries earlier, and the evidence now suggests Polynesians may have made contact with South America long before Europeans arrived as well. And honestly, I think that's what makes history interesting. It's not a straight line of one guy discovering everything first. It's a messy story of migrations, explorations, survival, bad decisions, lucky accidents, and humans constantly wandering into places they probably shouldn't have been able to reach. So maybe the real takeaway here isn't who discovered America, but instead how many people found it, lost it, rediscovered it, argued about it, and then wrote themselves into the story afterwards. Anyway, thank you all for listening, and remember, if history class taught you something was simple, it probably wasn't.